The evening was tranquil, the kind that blanketed the city in a serene calm that rarely lasted. The sprawling park, with its winding paths and old oak trees, was nearly empty, save for a few late joggers and dog walkers. The soft hum of cicadas filled the air, blending with the distant rustle of leaves in the light breeze. A wooden bench sat beneath a tall lamp post, its light casting a warm, golden glow. On the bench sat Olivia Carter, her posture straight but relaxed, her gaze fixed ahead as if lost in thought. Dressed in a simple tracksuit and sneakers, she appeared to be just another evening visitor to the park, someone who had stopped for a moment to enjoy the peace. But for those who knew her, this stillness was deceptive. Olivia wasn't just any woman, she was a former SWAT team commander, a decorated officer who had built her career on precision, discipline, and an unyielding sense of justice. Now retired from field operations, she worked as a trainer, molding the next generation of officers with the same rigorous standards she once set for herself. Tonight, however, Olivia wasn't thinking about her trainees. The day had been particularly exhausting, not physically but emotionally. She had spent the afternoon giving testimony in an internal investigation against several officers accused of corruption. It wasn't the first time Olivia had found herself in the position of holding her colleagues accountable, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. She had built a reputation for speaking out against abuse of power, a stance that had earned her respect in some circles and quiet resentment in others. The tension from the day lingered in her muscles, but the park had always been her escape. The soft sounds of nature and the absence of the city's usual chaos allowed her decompress, to let the weight of her responsibilities slip away, even if only for a little while. Unbeknownst to Olivia, she wasn't the only one observing the park tonight. From the shadowed edge of the nearby path, Officer Tom Hardy sat in his patrol car, his gaze fixed on her. Hardy was an officer with a record 10 years on the force and a reputation for being tough. But beneath the surface, there was something darker. Hardy had a history of letting his biases guide his actions, a trait that had gone unchecked for far too long. For Hardy, Olivia was more than just a woman sitting on a bench. She was a target, an anomaly in a neighborhood he believed she didn't belong in. The fact that she appeared calm, almost defiant in her stillness, only fueled his growing irritation. He didn't recognize her to him, she was just another stranger, and that was all the justification he needed to intervene. Hardy's fingers tapped against the steering wheel as he watched her, his mind racing with assumptions. She's probably waiting for someone, he thought. Or maybe she's here for something else. Drugs, maybe, or worse. The rational part of his mind knew he had no reason to act, no justification to approach her. But Hardy had never been one to let rationale get in the way of his instincts. He reached for his radio, hesitating for a moment before deciding against calling it in. This wasn't something he wanted to explain over the air. Instead, he adjusted his belt, checked his weapon, and stepped out of the car. The sound of his boots, crunching against the gravel path, broke the silence as he approached. Olivia heard him before she saw him, her years of training making her hyper-aware of her surroundings. She didn't move at first, her posture remaining relaxed, but her eyes shifted, subtly tracking his approach. When Hardy finally came into view, she turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet curiosity that seemed to unsettle him. Hardy wasn't used to this kind of reaction. Most people stiffened when they saw a cop walking toward them, their nerves giving away their guilt, or at least their discomfort. But this woman didn't flinch, and that irritated him. "Evening," Hardy said, his tone flat but edged with authority. He stopped a few feet away from the bench, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his holstered weapon. Olivia nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing. She could sense the tension radiating off him, the way his posture was just a little too rigid, his eyes scanning her as if searching for something incriminating. She'd seen officers like him before, men who thrived on control, who needed to assert their dominance to feel validated. It wasn't uncommon, but it was always disappointing, out kind of late. "Aren't you?" Hardy continued, his gaze narrowing. It wasn't a question so much as a challenge, a thinly veiled attempt to provoke her. Olivia tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "Just enjoying the evening," she replied, her voice steady. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no hint of the submission Hardy was hoping for. If anything, her composure only seemed to agitate him further. "You live around here?" he asked, his voice sharp. Olivia raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Is that a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Hardy's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching against his belt. He didn't like her tone, didn't like the way she seemed so unbothered by his presence. It wasn't how these interactions were supposed to go. He was the one in control, not her. "I'm asking the questions here," he snapped, stepping closer. "And I don't appreciate the attitude." Olivia remained still, her gaze steady. "I wasn't aware sitting on a bench was a crime," she said evenly. "But if I've done something wrong, feel free to enlighten me." Hardy's face flushed with frustration. He could feel the power dynamic slipping out of his grasp, and it infuriated him. He needed to regain control, to remind her who was in charge. Without another word, he reached for his handcuffs, the metal glinting in the light as he pulled them free. "Stand up," he ordered, his voice cold. Olivia's eyes flickered with something disappointment, perhaps, but she didn't argue. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and stood facing him. Hardy grabbed her wrist roughly, snapping one cuff around it before securing the other to the metal armrest of the bench. The sound of the lock clicking into place was jarring, a harsh reminder of the reality of the situation. "Stay right here," Hardy said, his voice laced with mock authority. "I'll be back." Olivia watched him as he walked away, her expression unreadable. She tested the cuff lightly, feeling the cold metal bite into her skin. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet determination. She wasn't worried about what Hardy would do next. She had faced far worse than him in her career. But as she sat back down, her mind was already working, calculating her next move. Hardy may have thought he was in control, but Olivia knew better. And soon, so would he. Officer Hardy strode away from the bench with a swagger in his step, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction. The sound of the cuffs locking around Olivia's wrist had been like music to his ears. It didn't matter that she hadn't actually done anything wrong. He had already made up his mind that she was guilty of something. People like her always were, at least in his view. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered to Hardy was control, and tonight he felt as though he had it firmly in his grip. As he moved farther down the path, Hardy pulled out his radio. He considered calling in a backup unit, but then he thought better of it. Why complicate things? He wanted to handle this alone, without anyone watching over his shoulder or questioning his methods. He'd done this before, cornered someone, pushed them into a vulnerable position, and walked away with a sense of triumph. This wasn't about the law or justice, it was about power. Olivia watched him go, her expression calm but calculating. She shifted slightly on the bench, testing the strength of the cuffs that bound her wrist to the metal armrest. They were secure, of course, standard-issue police cuffs that she herself had used countless times during her years on the force. But she wasn't testing them with any real hope of breaking free. She was simply assessing her situation, as she always did when faced with a challenge. Her mind worked quickly, running through potential scenarios and outcomes, analyzing Hardy's behavior and what it revealed about him. One thing was clear: Hardy wasn't operating within the bounds of the law. His actions were driven by something far more personal: bias, anger, or perhaps just an insatiable need to assert his authority. Olivia had dealt with men like him before, both in her time as a SWAT commander and earlier in her career. They were always the same small-minded individuals who wielded their power like a weapon, compensating for their insecurities by tearing others down. Hardy was no different, and Olivia knew that reasoning with him was unlikely to work. Still, she wasn't one to sit idly by and let the situation escalate unchecked. She glanced around the park, noting the sparse number of people still lingering in the area. A couple of joggers passed by in the distance, their headphones blocking out the world around them. A man walked his dog near the edge of the park, oblivious to her presence. There was no one close enough to intervene, not that she would have expected them to. People rarely stepped into situations like this. It wasn't fear necessarily, but a sense of detachment and unwillingness to get involved in something that didn't directly concern them. Olivia shifted her focus back to Hardy, who had stopped a few yards away to rummage through his patrol car. She couldn't see what he was doing, but she could hear the faint sound of the trunk opening and closing, followed by the rustle of papers. It didn't take much imagination to guess that he was preparing to fabricate evidence or create some kind of pretext to justify his actions. She had seen it before officers who crossed the line and then scrambled to cover their tracks, relying on their badge to shield them from accountability. But Hardy didn't know who he was dealing with. He didn't know that Olivia had spent years fighting against corruption within the system, that she had built her career on exposing officers like him, and he certainly didn't know that she was far from alone in this park. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Hardy's voice as he walked back toward her, a self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. In one hand, he held a clipboard with some forms clipped to it in the other. He held a small evidence bag containing what appeared to be a folded piece of paper. Olivia's eyes narrowed as she studied him, her mind already piecing together his plan. "Well," Hardy began, his tone dripping with condescension, "it looks like we've got ourselves a situation here." He held up the evidence bag, shaking it slightly, as if to draw her attention to its contents. "Found this near your bench. Care to explain?" Olivia didn't flinch. She didn't even glance at the bag. Instead, she met his gaze with a level stare, her expression calm and unreadable. "What is it?" she asked evenly. Hardy's smirk widened. "A little something I like to call probable cause," he said, waving the bag in front of her. "This note right here, it's got details about a drug deal that's supposed to go down tonight. Pretty convenient, huh? A lone woman sitting on a bench, looking all suspicious. And then I find this nearby. Looks like you've got some explaining to do." Olivia's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile, though her eyes remained cold. "Convenient indeed," she said softly, her voice laced with irony. "Tell me, Officer Hardy, how often do you find incriminating evidence neatly folded and waiting for you in plain sight?" Hardy's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "You can play coy all you want," he snapped, his tone hardening. "But the evidence speaks for itself, and unless you've got a damn good reason for being here tonight, I'd say you're in some serious trouble." Olivia tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I've already told you why I'm here," she said, "and unless you've got more than a piece of paper you conveniently found, I'd say you're grasping at straws." Hardy took a step closer, his face inches from hers. "Watch your tone," he growled. "You're not in a position to argue." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Olivia's face, disappointment. She shook her head slightly, her voice calm but firm. "You don't know what you're doing, Hardy. You're digging yourself into a hole you won't be able to climb out of. Walk away now, and maybe you'll salvage what's left of your career." Hardy's face turned red with anger, and for a moment it seemed as though he might strike her. But instead, he straightened up and took a step back, his smirk returning. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he sneered. "You think you can talk your way out of this? Not tonight, sweetheart. Tonight, you're just another perp." He reached for his radio, his finger hovering over the button. Olivia watched him carefully, her mind racing. She wasn't worried about what he might say or do. She had already anticipated his every move. But she also knew that the situation was nearing a breaking point, and she needed to act before it spiraled out of control. Before Hardy could press the button, a sudden voice broke through the tension. "Hardy, what the hell are you doing?" Both Olivia and Hardy turned to see a figure approaching from the shadows. It was another officer, but not one Olivia recognized. The man was older, his face lined with years of experience, and his expression was one of disbelief and anger. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze shifting between Hardy and Olivia. "Reynolds," Hardy said quickly, his tone defensive. "What are you doing here?" "I got a call," Reynolds said, his voice sharp. "A civilian reported a suspicious incident involving a patrol officer. Imagine my surprise when I find you here, pulling this nonsense." Hardy's face turned pale, but he quickly tried to recover. "I was just handling a situation," he said. "This woman..." "Enough," Reynolds interrupted, holding up a hand. "I've seen enough." He turned to Olivia, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Olivia nodded, her gaze never leaving Hardy. "I'm fine," she said, "but I'd suggest you have a talk with your officer before he makes things worse." Reynolds sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Trust me, I will." He turned back to Hardy, his expression hardening. "Take the cuffs off her. Now." Hardy hesitated, his jaw tightening. But under Reynolds' glare, he reluctantly pulled out his keys and unlocked the cuffs, freeing Olivia's wrist. She stood slowly, rubbing the skin where the metal had dug into her flesh. Her gaze remained steady, her composure unshaken. "This isn't over," Hardy muttered under his breath, but Olivia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already won this round, and she knew that Hardy's time was running out. Officer Hardy stood frozen for a moment, his jaw clenched as he reluctantly pocketed the handcuffs he had just removed from Olivia Carter's wrist. His humiliation was palpable, his mind racing to figure out how to salvage his authority. Nearby, Officer Reynolds crossed his arms, his stern gaze boring into Hardy as if daring him to make another mistake. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, as the three of them stood in uneasy silence. Olivia, however, remained calm and composed, brushing off her wrist as though she hadn't just been subjected to Hardy's petty display of power. Her calm demeanor only served to further unnerve Hardy, who couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control of the situation. "Hardy, we need to talk," Reynolds finally said, his voice low but firm. He motioned for Hardy to step aside, but Hardy hesitated, casting a wary glance at Olivia before reluctantly following Reynolds a few steps away. The two officers stood facing each other, their conversation carried out in hushed but heated tones. Olivia, now free from the bench, took the opportunity to stretch her arms and survey her surroundings. Though her outward demeanor remained calm, her mind was already working on the next steps. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Hardy wasn't the type to back down easily, and his bruised ego would only make him more dangerous. From the corner of her eye, Olivia noticed a faint flicker of movement in the distance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but her years of training had honed her instincts to pick up on such details. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the tree line, where the faint outline of a figure could be seen lurking in the shadows. It wasn't unusual for parks to have their share of late-night wanderers, but something about this figure felt deliberate. They weren't moving like someone out for a casual stroll. They were watching. Olivia made a mental note of it, but didn't react outwardly. Instead, she turned her attention back to Hardy and Reynolds, who were still locked in their tense exchange. "You're out of line," Hardy Reynolds was saying, his voice sharper now, though still low enough to keep their conversation private. "You had no reason to detain her, no probable cause, nothing. What the hell were you thinking?" She was acting suspicious, Hardy shot back, his voice rising slightly in frustration. "Sitting out here alone late at night? Come on, Reynolds, you know the type." "I was just doing my job," Reynolds scoffed, shaking his head. "Don't give me that crap. You're not a rookie, Hardy. You know better than to pull this nonsense. And you sure as hell know you can't go around cuffing people without cause." Hardy bristled, his face flushing red. "I found evidence near her bench," he said defensively, holding up the evidence bag with the folded note. "It's enough to warrant further investigation." Reynolds snatched the bag from Hardy's hand, inspecting its contents with a critical eye. He unfolded the note and scanned the writing, his brow furrowing. "This," he said incredulously, holding the paper up. "This is your evidence? It's barely legible, Hardy. And it could have been dropped by anyone." Hardy's jaw tightened, his frustration boiling over. "You're not seeing the bigger picture," he argued. "She's not supposed to be here. People like her don't just stop." Reynolds cut him off sharply, his voice cold. "Don't finish that sentence." The implication in Hardy's words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Reynolds's expression darkened. Olivia, still watching from a short distance away, couldn't hear every word, but she could read their body language well enough to understand the dynamics at play. Hardy was defensive, grasping at straws, while Reynolds was trying to rein him in before things spiraled even further out of control. But Olivia knew it was a losing battle. Hardy's pride had been wounded, and men like him didn't take kindly to being challenged, especially not in front of witnesses. As if to prove her point, Hardy suddenly turned on his heel and stormed back toward Olivia, his expression a mix of anger and determination. Reynolds called after him, but Hardy ignored it, his focus solely on regaining what little authority he felt he still had. "We're not done here," Hardy said, his voice hard as he approached Olivia. "I've got more questions for you." Olivia raised an eyebrow, her calm composure unshaken. "Questions, or another excuse to abuse your power," she said evenly, her tone laced with just enough sarcasm to irritate him further. Hardy's face twisted in anger, and for a moment it seemed as though he might lash out. But before he could say anything, a sudden noise interrupted the standoff, a low hum, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Olivia recognized it immediately, the unmistakable sound of a vehicle engine approaching. Her gaze shifted toward the park's entrance, where the faint glow of headlights could be seen cutting through the darkness. The vehicle came into view moments later, a large black SUV with tinted windows. It rolled to a stop just beyond the tree line, its engine still running. Hardy stiffened, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster as he watched the SUV. Reynolds, who had followed Hardy back toward Olivia, frowned in confusion. "Who the hell is that?" Reynolds muttered under his breath. Olivia didn't answer. She didn't need to. She already knew who it was, or, more accurately, who they were. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Her former team had arrived. The SUV's doors opened simultaneously, and 3 figures stepped out, their movements precise and coordinated. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but their demeanor was unmistakable, calm, confident, and professional. These were not ordinary civilians. These were operatives, and Olivia knew each of them by name. The first to approach was Marcus Kane, her former second in command. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding even without a uniform. Behind him were Elena Torres, the team's tactical expert, and Daniel Wright, their communications specialist. Each of them carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who had seen their share of danger and come out the other side stronger for it. "Evening," Marcus said as he approached, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a knife. His eyes flicked briefly to Olivia, a silent question passing between them, before settling on Hardy and Reynolds. "Something going on here?" Hardy bristled, his hand still hovering near his holster. "This is a police matter," he said stiffly. "You need to back off." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Police matter, huh?" he said casually. "Funny, because it looks like you're harassing a woman for no reason." Reynolds stepped forward, holding up a hand in a placating gesture. "Look, we don't want any trouble here," he said. "This is just a misunderstanding." Marcus's gaze shifted to Reynolds, his eyes narrowing slightly. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, "because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like misconduct." Hardy's patience snapped. "I said back off," he barked, his voice rising. "This is none of your business." Before Marcus could respond, Olivia spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "They're with me," she said simply. Hardy froze, his eyes darting back to Olivia in disbelief. "What?" "They're with me," Olivia repeated, her gaze steady. "And I'd suggest you listen to what they have to say." The realization hit Hardy like a freight train, and for the first time that night, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He glanced back at Marcus, then at the other two operatives, as if trying to piece together the connection. But it was too late. The dynamic had shifted, and he was no longer in control. Marcus stepped closer, his posture relaxed but undeniably authoritative. "Here's how this is going to go," he said, his voice low and even. "You're going to step away from her. You're going to take a breath, think real hard about your next move, and then you're going to walk away before you make things worse for yourself. Got it?" Hardy's face flushed with anger, but he didn't respond. He was cornered, and he knew it. Reynolds, sensing the shift, placed a hand on Hardy's shoulder, his expression grim. "Come on, Hardy," he said quietly. "Let it go." For a moment it seemed as though Hardy might resist. His pride was written all over his face, his jaw tight with barely restrained fury. But then, slowly, he let out a sharp breath and stepped back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This isn't over," he muttered through gritted teeth. "No," Olivia said softly, her gaze unwavering. "It's just beginning." The air in the park was electric, charged with tension as the black SUV remained parked at the edge of the tree line. Its engine hummed softly, a mechanical growl that seemed to match the simmering hostility radiating from Officer Hardy. He stood stiffly, his fists clenched at his sides, his face an unreadable mask of frustration and suppressed rage. Beside him, Officer Reynolds kept a watchful eye, his expression grim and uneasy. Marcus Kane, Elena Torres, and Daniel Wright stood just a few feet away, their calm, composed demeanor a stark contrast to the barely contained fury of the officers. Olivia Carter, now standing with her arms loosely crossed, watched the unfolding scene with quiet intensity. She knew that the next few moments would set the tone for whatever came next. Hardy's pride was in tatters, but his stubbornness refused to let him back down completely. He hadn't spent years building his reputation as the tough, no-nonsense officer just to let a group of civilians, no matter how intimidating they looked, undermine him. His hand hovered near his holstered weapon, not in an overtly threatening way, but enough to make his intent clear. If they wanted to challenge him, he would be ready. "What's the meaning of this?" Hardy demanded, his voice sharp and accusing. "Who are these people, and why the hell are they interfering in police business?" "They're not interfering," Olivia said calmly, her tone measured. "They're here to make sure this situation doesn't escalate any further, And more importantly, they're here because I called them. Hardy blinked, his confusion evident despite his attempt to mask it. You called them, he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. What the hell are you talking about? Olivia met his gaze steadily, her expression unyielding. You didn't think I came here alone, did you? She said, her voice low but carrying an undeniable edge. You didn't think I'd walk into a public park at night without making sure someone had my back? Hardy's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding audibly. He turned his gaze to Marcus, Elena, and Daniel, his eyes narrowing. So what are you, her bodyguards, her little entourage? Marcus stepped forward, his towering frame casting a long shadow under the park's dim lights. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of amusement. Something like that, he said, his tone light but with an undercurrent of steel. Let's just say we have a vested interest in making sure Olivia stays safe. Reynolds, who had remained silent for much of the exchange, finally spoke up, his voice laced with exasperation. Hardy, for God's sake, stand down. Can't you see what's happening here? You've already crossed the line. Don't make it worse. But Hardy wasn't listening. His ego had been bruised too deeply, his authority undermined too thoroughly. He couldn't let it go, not now, not ever. His eyes darted between the faces of the newcomers, searching for a weak point, a sign of hesitation. But there was none. They stood firm, their confidence unshaken, and that only fueled his frustration. This is still my scene, Hardy spat, his voice rising. I'm the officer in charge here, and I'm not going to be bullied off it by a bunch of what Olivia interrupted, her voice cutting through his tirade like a blade. She took a step forward, her gaze locked onto his. Say it, Hardy. Finish your sentence. For a brief moment, Hardy looked as though he might actually take the bait. His lips parted, his chest rising as he drew in a sharp breath. But then he hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. He knew he was dangerously close to crossing a line he couldn't come back from, and for all his bravado, even he wasn't reckless enough to go that far. Instead, he shifted his focus to Olivia, his expression hardening. I don't care who you are, he said, his voice laced with venom. You don't get to tell me how to do my job. Your job, Olivia echoed, her tone incredulous. Your job is to serve and protect, Hardy, not to harass innocent people, not to fabricate evidence, and certainly not to put your own ego ahead of the law. Hardy's face darkened, his knuckles whitening as his fists clenched tighter. He opened his mouth to retort, but Marcus cut him off, stepping forward with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Enough, Marcus said firmly, his deep voice resonating like a drumbeat. This isn't a pissing contest, Hardy. You've already shown everyone here exactly what kind of officer you are. Now it's time to stop digging your grave any deeper. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment it seemed as though Hardy might explode. His body was rigid, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. But before he could act, a sudden movement from the shadows caught everyone's attention. From the tree line, another figure emerged, moving with a quiet grace that belied their presence. They were dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by the low brim of a baseball cap. Despite their unassuming appearance, there was an undeniable air of competence about them, a sense of purpose that immediately set them apart from a casual passerby. Olivia recognized them instantly, her eyes narrowing slightly as a hint of surprise crossed her face. It was Tasha Reynolds, another former member of her SWAT team and a specialist in covert operations. Tasha was known for her ability to move unnoticed, to gather intelligence without ever being detected. And judging by the way she approached now, she had been watching the situation unfold for some time. Tasha, Olivia said, her voice carrying a note of both relief and curiosity. "I didn't think you'd make it." Tasha gave a small, wry smile, her eyes flicking briefly to Hardy before returning to Olivia. "I thought you might need an extra set of eyes," she said, her tone casual. "Looks like I was right." Hardy's eyes darted between Tasha and the others, his confusion deepening. "Who the hell are all these people?" he demanded, his voice rising in frustration. "What is this? Some kind of setup?" "You set yourself up," Tasha said bluntly, her tone sharp enough to cut. "You walked into this situation with a chip on your shoulder, and now you're scrambling to cover your ass." Hardy's face flushed red, his anger threatening to boil over. "I don't have to listen to this," he snapped. "You people have no authority here." "No authority," Marcus interjected, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "You might want to rethink that. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're the one who's out of line." The tension in the air was nearly suffocating now, the lines between the two sides clearly drawn. Olivia could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, but she refused to let it show. She took a step forward, her gaze locked onto Hardy. "This is your last chance, Hardy," she said quietly, her voice steady but firm. "Walk away. Let it go. Before you do something you'll regret." Hardy's breath came in short, sharp bursts, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain his fury. His pride was screaming at him to fight back, to assert his authority no matter the cost. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice of reason whispered that he was outmatched, that he was teetering on the edge of a cliff with no safety net below. Finally, with a sharp, frustrated exhale, Hardy took a step back, his hands dropping to his sides. He didn't say a word, didn't meet anyone's eyes. He simply turned and walked away, his movements stiff and mechanical, like a man on autopilot. Reynolds watched him go, his expression a mixture of relief and disappointment. He turned back to Olivia, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again," he said quietly. Olivia nodded, her gaze softening slightly. "See that it doesn't," she said. "For his sake as much as anyone else's." Reynolds nodded once before following after Hardy, leaving Olivia and her team standing alone in the park. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was a different kind of tension now, one of relief, of resolution. Marcus stepped closer to Olivia, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Olivia gave a small, tired smile. "I'm fine," she said. "Thanks to you all." Tasha crossed her arms, a faint smirk playing at her lips. "You didn't really think we'd let you handle this alone, did you?" Olivia chuckled softly, the sound breaking through the weight of the moment. "I guess not," she said, "but it's good to know I can still count on you." The group lingered for a moment longer, the bond between them unspoken but undeniable. Then, one by one, they began to move, blending back into the shadows from which they had come. The park fell silent once more, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Olivia stood alone for a moment, her gaze fixed on the empty path ahead. The battle wasn't over, not yet, but tonight at least she had won. And that was enough. The silence in the park hung like a thick curtain as Officer Hardy retreated toward his patrol car, his movements stiff and mechanical, a man simmering in barely restrained rage. Every step away from the confrontation with Olivia Carter and her former SWAT team felt like another blow to his pride. The humiliation burned in his chest, a toxic mix of anger and wounded ego fueling his every thought. He wanted to turn back, to reassert control, but he knew the tide had turned against him. They had outmaneuvered him not with violence, but with sheer confidence and authority, the kind he could never seem to command despite his years on the force. Hardy reached his car, gripping the open door frame tightly as he leaned against it, staring into the dimly lit park. He could still see them, Olivia standing tall, calm and collected, her SWAT team gathered around her like sentinels. He couldn't understand it, couldn't wrap his mind around how everything had spiraled so quickly out of his control. The arrogance he carried into every encounter had failed him, and now he stood on the brink of something far worse than a simple reprimand. He could feel it, a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. But instead of backing down, his anger twisted into something darker, something more dangerous. "You think you've won?" Hardy muttered under his breath, his hand gripping his radio. His fingers hovered over the button for a moment, his mind racing. He wasn't going to let this end here. No, not like this. He glanced around, his eyes darting to the shadows of the park, looking for anything or anyone that could tip the balance back in his favor. And then, as if by some cruel stroke of fate, he saw them, a group of younger men lingering near the edge of the playground, their laughter carrying faintly through the night air. They weren't doing anything suspicious, just hanging out, talking, and occasionally glancing toward the confrontation that had unfolded across the park. But in Hardy's mind, they were an opportunity, a narrative he could shape. If he couldn't regain control directly, he would create a distraction, something to shift the focus away from his failure and onto someone else. He keyed the radio, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Dispatch, this is Officer Hardy. I've got a group of potential suspects congregating near the north end of the park, requesting backup for an investigation." The crackle of the radio confirmed his transmission, and Hardy allowed himself a small, bitter smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A way to divert attention, to regain a sliver of authority in a night that had already unraveled far beyond his control. Back at the bench, Olivia watched Hardy's movements with a practiced eye, her instincts on high alert. She had seen that kind of posture before: the rigid shoulders, the clenched jaw, the deliberate gestures meant to mask uncertainty. Hardy was far from done, and she knew it. Men like him didn't let things go. They clung to their power like a lifeline, desperate to reassert dominance even when it meant crossing lines they couldn't uncross. "What's he doing?" Tasha Reynolds murmured, stepping closer to Olivia. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was an edge of concern beneath her calm exterior. Olivia didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on Hardy, studying him, reading the subtle cues in his body language. "He's plotting," she said finally, her voice steady, trying to figure out his next move. Marcus Kane, standing just behind them, let out a low sigh. "He doesn't know when to quit, does he?" he said, his tone tinged with both irritation and a hint of amusement. "What's the play, Liv? You want us to step in?" "Not yet," Olivia said, shaking her head. "Let him dig his hole a little deeper." Elena Torres, who had been keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings, shifted her stance slightly, her sharp gaze locking onto the group of young men Hardy had fixated on. "Looks like he's found himself a new target," she said, her voice cold. "That's not going to end well." Olivia followed Elena's line of sight, her expression darkening as she took in the scene. The group of young men, oblivious to Hardy's intentions, continued their casual conversation, unaware that they were now the center of his twisted plan. Olivia's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger breaking through her calm facade. She had seen this play out before: innocent people scapegoated to cover for someone else's mistakes. It was a pattern as old as time, and one she had fought against her entire career. "Damn it," Olivia muttered under her breath. She turned to Marcus and Tasha, her voice firm. "We need to move. If he goes after them, this is going to escalate fast." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "I'll take point," he said, already moving toward the edge of the clearing. "Tasha, flank him. Elena, stay with Liv and keep eyes on the group." The team moved like clockwork, their years of training and experience shining through in every calculated step. They didn't need words to coordinate; their actions were seamless, a silent choreography born of trust and discipline. Olivia followed Marcus's lead, her every sense attuned to the unfolding situation. This wasn't just about stopping Hardy, it was about protecting those young men from becoming collateral damage in his misguided quest for control. As Hardy began walking toward the group, his posture rigid with false authority, the young men finally noticed him. Their laughter faded, replaced by wary glances and murmurs of confusion. They weren't strangers to interactions with law enforcement, and they knew better than to make any sudden moves. But their unease was clear, their shoulders tensing as Hardy closed the distance between them. "Evening, gentlemen," Hardy said, his voice loud and commanding. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here this late?" One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a calm demeanor, stepped forward slightly. "Just talking, officer," he said, his tone polite but cautious. "Is there a problem?" "There might be," Hardy said, his eyes narrowing. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" The young man frowned, his confusion evident. "No, sir," he said. "We're just hanging out. We're not causing any trouble." Hardy's gaze swept over the group, his expression hard and scrutinizing. "That's what they all say," he muttered, more to himself than to them. He reached for his radio, his movements deliberate and slow, as though he were daring them to react. From her position a few yards away, Olivia's patience finally snapped. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "That's enough, Hardy." The suddenness of her intervention startled everyone, including Hardy. He turned to face her, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Stay out of this," he barked. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when you start targeting innocent people to cover your own mistakes," Olivia said sharply. She closed the distance between them, her posture radiating authority. "You've already crossed the line once tonight. Don't make it worse." Hardy's face twisted with fury, his hand dropping to his holster as he took a step toward her. "I said, stay out of this," he growled. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job. And you don't get to abuse your badge," Olivia shot back, her voice rising. "You want to make this about me? Fine. Let's settle it right here, right now. But leave them out of it." For a moment, the park fell deathly silent, the weight of Olivia's words hanging heavy in the air. Hardy's hand hovered near his weapon, his body trembling with barely restrained rage. But before he could act, Marcus stepped into his line of sight, his imposing frame blocking Hardy's view of Olivia. "You've got two choices," Hardy, Marcus said quietly, his voice low and dangerous. "You walk away, or we make you walk away. Either way, this ends now." Hardy hesitated, his eyes darting between Marcus and Olivia. He could feel the control slipping from his grasp, the power dynamic shifting irrevocably against him. For all his bluster, he was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outmatched. Finally, with a sharp, frustrated exhale, Hardy lowered his hand and stepped back. He didn't say a word, didn't meet anyone's gaze. He simply turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy with defeat. As the tension began to dissipate, Olivia let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "It's over," Marcus said quietly, his gaze still fixed on Hardy's retreating figure. "For now," Olivia replied, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But people like him? They never really stop, they just wait for the next opportunity." And in her gut, she knew Hardy wasn't done. Not yet. The oppressive weight of the night lingered as Hardy disappeared into the darkness, his retreat more ominous than reassuring. Olivia Carter stood in the park, the adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through her veins. Around her, Marcus, Elena, and Tasha held their positions, their sharp eyes scanning the park's perimeter. They knew better than to relax too soon. Men like Hardy didn't just walk away, they plotted, brooded, and returned with twice the malice. The young men Hardy had targeted began to drift away cautiously, throwing uneasy glances over their shoulders. Olivia gave them a reassuring nod as they departed, but inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to snap. Tasha broke the silence first, her voice low but urgent. "He's not done. You saw the way he left, too quiet, too controlled. He's not going to let this go." Marcus grunted in agreement, his broad shoulders tense with anticipation. "Agreed. He's humiliated, and guys like Hardy don't take that lightly. We need to move before he does." Olivia held up a hand, her mind racing. "No," she said firmly. "If we leave now, we're giving him the space he needs to twist this. He'll regroup, call back up, and spin the narrative. We stay. Let him come to us. We control the narrative." Elena, always the strategist, tilted her head thoughtfully. "That's risky, Liv. If he comes back with more officers, this could escalate into something ugly." Olivia's gaze was steely. "It already is ugly. The difference is, we're ready for him. If we let him dictate the terms, we lose the upper hand. We stay." Reluctantly, the team nodded, falling back into formation like the well-oiled unit they had always been. They didn't need uniforms to move with precision. Each of them instinctively knew their role, their positions shifting subtly to account for every angle of approach. Tasha melted into the shadows, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Marcus and Elena flanked Olivia, their postures relaxed but ready for anything. And Olivia herself stood tall, her presence commanding, as though daring Hardy to make his next move. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. The park was eerily quiet now, the earlier hum of distant laughter and footsteps replaced by an oppressive stillness. Olivia's sharp ears caught the faintest sound, a low rumble in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. She knew that sound. It wasn't Hardy's patrol car. It was something bigger, heavier. Reinforcements. Sure enough, 2 squad cars appeared at the far end of the park, their headlights piercing the darkness. Hardy had returned, and he hadn't come alone. Olivia's heart sank as the vehicles came to a halt, their doors swinging open in near-perfect unison. 4 officers stepped out, their faces obscured by the harsh glow of the headlights. Hardy emerged last, his posture rigid, his expression smug. He strode toward Olivia with an air of false confidence, flanked by the other officers like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. "Carter," Hardy called out, his voice carrying across the park. "Still here, I see. Guess you didn't take my advice to leave." Olivia didn't move, her gaze fixed on him as he approached. "Advice," she said evenly, her tone calm but cutting. "I don't take advice from bullies." Hardy's smirk faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. "Bullies, huh? Funny, coming from someone who thinks she can run the show just because she's got a couple of friends backing her up." "You brought backup too," Olivia pointed out, nodding toward the officers behind him. "What's the matter, Hardy? Couldn't handle me on your own?" The jab hit its mark, and Hardy's face darkened. "This isn't about me," he snapped. "It's about you. And whatever game you're playing here. You think you're untouchable? Think again. You're interfering with an active investigation, obstructing justice. Hell, you're lucky I haven't arrested you already." Olivia took a deliberate step forward, her presence radiating authority. "Arrest me," she said, her voice icy. "For what, exactly? Sitting on a bench? Refusing to let you harass innocent people? Go ahead, Hardy. Arrest me. Let's see how well that holds up in court." Hardy's jaw tightened, his composure slipping as the power dynamic shifted once again. The officers behind him exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence faltering. They had followed Hardy into this confrontation under the assumption that it was a routine call, but now they were beginning to see the cracks in his story. Olivia wasn't just another civilian. She was composed, confident, and clearly used to situations like this. And Hardy, he looked like a man grasping at straws. "You're making a big mistake," Hardy growled, his voice low and threatening. "You don't know who you're messing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Olivia shot back. "A coward with a badge. A man so desperate to prove his power that he's willing to destroy anyone who challenges him." The words hit Hardy like a slap, and for a moment he looked as though he might lash out. But before he could act, Marcus stepped forward, his towering presence drawing every eye. "That's enough," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "We're done playing games. Hardy, you've already crossed the line tonight. Don't make it worse for yourself." Hardy turned on Marcus, his anger boiling over. "Stay out of this," he snapped. "This is between me and her." "No," Marcus said simply, his gaze steady. "This is between you and the law, and right now you're on the wrong side of it." The standoff reached its breaking point. Hardy's hand moved toward his holster, his fingers twitching with barely restrained rage. The officers behind him shifted nervously, their uncertainty growing. And then, in one swift motion, Olivia raised her hand a signal. From the shadows, Tasha emerged, her movements silent and precise. In her hand was a small device, the faint glow of a red light blinking ominously. She held it up for everyone to see, her expression unreadable. "What's that?" Hardy demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Evidence," Tasha said simply. "Every word you've said tonight, every lie, every threat, all recorded." The color drained from Hardy's face as the weight of her words sank in. He had walked into the park tonight thinking he held all the cards, but now he realized just how thoroughly he had been outplayed. The officers behind him shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty to Hardy wavering in the face of the mounting evidence against him. "You're bluffing," Hardy said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You don't have anything." Tasha tilted her head slightly, her gaze cold. "Try me." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The park seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. Finally, Hardy let out a sharp exhale, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. He turned away, muttering something under his breath, and stalked back toward his patrol car. The other officers hesitated, then slowly followed, their heads bowed in a mixture of shame and defeat. As the squad cars disappeared into the night, Olivia let out a slow breath, the tension in her body finally easing. Tasha stepped up beside her, slipping the recording device back into her pocket with a faint smirk. "Well," Tasha said, her tone light. "That was fun." Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've got a strange idea of fun." Olivia smiled faintly, her gaze still fixed on the empty path where Hardy had disappeared. "It's not over," she said quietly. "Men like him don't give up that easily." "No," Marcus agreed. "But tonight we won. And that's a start." Together, the team turned and began to walk away, their footsteps fading into the night. The park was quiet once more, but the echoes of the confrontation lingered, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, the fight for accountability was far from over. And Olivia Carter, with her unshakable resolve and the strength of her team behind her, was ready for whatever came next. The park was eerily quiet now, the tension that had electrified the air just moments ago dissipating like smoke. Olivia Carter stood under the dim glow of a street lamp, her gaze fixed on the empty path where Hardy and his squad cars had disappeared. The night seemed heavier somehow, as though the confrontation had left an indelible mark on the space. Around her, Marcus, Tasha, and Elena remained vigilant, their body language still tense despite the apparent resolution. They knew, just as Olivia did, that this wasn't truly over. Men like Hardy didn't retreat for long. They regrouped, rearmed, and returned with more venom than ever. For a moment, no one spoke. The gravity of what had just unfolded weighed on them all, a stark reminder of why they had once chosen to serve in the first place, to fight against exactly this kind of abuse of power. Olivia finally broke the silence, her voice steady but carrying a weight of exhaustion. "Thank you," she said simply, glancing at each of her former teammates in turn. "I couldn't have done this without you." Marcus shrugged, his imposing frame still rigid with barely contained anger. "We weren't going to let you face that alone," he said. "Not after everything you've done for us, for the team." Elena, ever the strategist, leaned against a nearby tree, her sharp eyes scanning the park for any lingering threats. "He's not done," she said bluntly, her voice cool and measured. "You know that, right? Hardy's the type to double down. He's going to try to spin this, make it about you being the problem." Olivia nodded, her expression grim. "I know," she said. "That's why we need to stay ahead of him. He's desperate now, which makes him dangerous." Tasha smirked faintly, her hands slipping into her jacket pockets. "Good thing we've got a recording of everything he said tonight," she remarked. "It's going to be hard for him to weasel out of that." "It's not just about Hardy," Olivia said, her voice quieter now though no less resolute. "He's part of something bigger, a culture that lets people like him thrive. If we're going to stop this, we can't just focus on him. We need to go after the system that protects him." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with the others. They had all seen it before, the unspoken codes, the unwritten rules that allowed bad officers to slip through the cracks while good ones were silenced or pushed out. It was a cycle they had spent their careers fighting against, and tonight had been just another battle in a war that felt never-ending. Marcus exhaled heavily, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. "You're right," he said. "But taking on the system, that's a fight that doesn't end." "It doesn't have to end," Olivia replied, her voice firm. "We just have to keep pushing. Keep shining a light on people like Hardy until there's nowhere left for them to hide." Elena straightened, her sharp gaze locking onto Olivia. "So what's the next move?" she asked. "You know he's going to file a report, probably paint you as the aggressor. We need to be ready." "I'll handle it," Olivia said, her confidence unwavering. "We have the recording, witness statements, and the truth on our side. Let him try to twist the story. I've dealt with worse." Tasha smirked again, this time with a hint of admiration. "You always did know how to play the long game," she said. "It's why you were the best." Olivia allowed herself a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's not about being the best," she said. "It's about doing what's right. And right now, what's right is making sure Hardy and everyone like him is held accountable." The conversation was interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps approaching. The team instinctively tensed, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. A man emerged from the shadows, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He was tall and middle-aged, dressed in plain clothes that suggested he was off-duty, though his bearing and the badge clipped to his belt marked him as law enforcement. "Captain Carter," the man asked, his voice cautious but respectful. "I'm Lieutenant Daniels, Internal Affairs." Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, her instincts immediately on high alert. "Lieutenant," she said evenly, "what brings Iowa to the park at this hour?" Daniels stepped closer, his posture carefully non-threatening. "We got a tip," he said, "about Hardy. And about you." He glanced around at the others, his gaze lingering on Marcus and Tasha. Your team, I assume. They're with me, Olivia said firmly. What kind of tip? Daniels hesitated for a moment before reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small notepad. We've been watching Hardy for a while, he admitted. Tonight's incident isn't his first, but it might be the one that finally pushes things over the edge. Olivia's expression remained neutral, though her mind was racing. What do you mean? Daniels flipped through the notepad, his brow furrowing. Hardy's got a history: excessive force complaints, questionable arrests, intimidation tactics. But until now, nothing's ever stuck. Tonight, though, let's just say he's made some powerful enemies, you included. Olivia folded her arms, her gaze unyielding. So what happens now? Daniels looked her in the eye, his expression serious. Now, we build a case. Your recording is a start, but we're going to need more witnesses, documentation, anything that shows a pattern of behavior. If you're willing to cooperate, we can take him down. Marcus stepped forward, his tone wary. And if she doesn't cooperate? Daniels met his gaze without flinching. Then Hardy gets to keep his badge, and he'll come after her and you with everything he's got. A heavy silence followed his words, the implications clear. Olivia knew the risks, knew that taking on Hardy meant putting herself and her team in the crosshairs. But she also knew that walking away wasn't an option. Not for her. Not for the people Hardy had hurt and would continue to hurt if he wasn't stopped. We'll cooperate, Olivia said finally, her voice steady. But this doesn't end with Hardy. If we're doing this, we're going after the whole system that let him get this far. Daniels nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Fair enough, he said. Just be ready. This won't be easy. It never is, Olivia replied. Daniels tipped his head in acknowledgement before turning and walking away, his footsteps fading into the night. The team watched him go, the weight of the conversation settling heavily over them. So it begins, Elena said quietly, breaking the silence. Olivia glanced at her, her expression resolute. It's already begun, she said. We just have to finish it. As the team prepared to leave the park, Olivia allowed herself a moment to reflect. Tonight had been a battle, a hard-fought one, but it was far from the end. Hardy was just one man, a symptom of a larger problem that needed to be rooted out at its core. The road ahead would be long and grueling, but Olivia was no stranger to uphill battles. With her team by her side and the truth on her side, she knew they could make a difference. Together, they walked into the darkness, ready for whatever came next.